Hey everybody, welcome to looking at your historical origins of sociology. I'm sorry I'm not there with you guys today. I am dealing with a massive sore throat, but I should be back with you on Monday. The origins of sociology. Sociology is a relatively new science, only being around since about the late 1800s. With sociology, it gets spurred on as a science of us looking at how our society operates and how the mechanisms of society exist. And if you look at a lot of these historical events, the Industrial Revolution was a massive social shift. We went from cottage industry and working within the home to major mechanization and even really the development of the middle class. You have the French Revolution, where the poor were willing to overthrow the wealthy because of such a disparity in class. Westward expansion here in the United States, you have this idea of manifest destiny, that it is our right to move out west to conquer this great land. What does that mean about our society and the way that we think and how we interact together? The U.S. Civil War, especially after emancipation, how do we rebuild? How do we kind of construct a new normal within our society? What does that end up looking like? What further problems does it end up causing? And then even in the early 20th century, you have women's voting rights in the early 1900s. This is a huge time of change and people looking at the government, the culture that they come from, their societies, and trying to grasp some sort of understanding of who they were and what it all meant. And because of that, sociology is a natural reflection of that. Auguste Comte is going to be considered the father of sociology, not Durkheim. He believed that there had to be a scientific or an objective reality to societies. And he said to understand a society, you have to look at it as it actually operates, meaning that not how we hope our world to be or how we wish it, not this ideal that we construct in our head, but the world as it truly is, this kind of objective observation. He turned this way to look at and study society positivism, this objective observation, taking the self out of it. He says to actually have knowledge about something, to have it scientifically studied, that's when we can say we are positive, which is kind of where it generates the term. Knowledge we are quote unquote positive or sure of can only be known if it is scientifically studied. So this wasn't just walking around and saying, I think there's discrimination. It is going and researching and being able to prove, being able to show, being able to make it concrete evidence. He distinguished between what he called social statics and social dynamics. Easiest way to kind of resolve these terms in your head. Something that is static doesn't really change. Now, you might sit there and say that there's a variety of different types of families, and there's a ton of different religions, and people speak really thousands of different languages. But for the most part, within any society, family stays relatively the same. Religion has remained relatively the same. Language remains relatively the same. Maybe there's some slang in there that wasn't there, but no real big shifts. So when we look at social stability, we still believe in a two-parent household. Now, are there a lot of single-parent households? Are there variations in households? Yes, but the idea of maintaining family is still a very static idea. When we look at social dynamics, this is when we look at how societies change in really kind of extreme ways, like dynamic. So anytime we have a movement, the civil rights, women's rights, gays' rights, anytime there's some kind of revolution, a change or an upheaval, a throwing over, the toppling of something, you're seeing a dynamic change. The interesting thing is, even after a dynamic change, we often return to a static state. We hold on to those things within a society that maintain stability. There are three major contributors that you need to know for sociology. These contributors are going to pop up now and again as their major theories pop up now and again throughout the entire course. The first one is Karl Marx, and many of you should remember Marx from world history. Marx looked at sociology as a political power struggle. He was very negative towards capitalism. He looked very heavily at materialism and asserted that the production of material goods shaped all aspects of society, that those who owned the factories were the haves, those who worked for the factories were the have-nots, more commonly known as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, they were the wealthy class. So if you've ever called someone bougie, it comes from this term bourgeoisie. They had the money, they therefore also had the power. Proletariat would have been the working class. In Karl Marx's original look at society, there really were only two classes, the wealthy and the poor. America tends to be a kind of a weird thing for Karl Marx because we have this magical third class, the middle class, which makes his theory not always fit American society very well. Karl Marx looked at things like the French Revolution, and he believed that when there were these cases with the haves and the have-nots, that class conflict was inevitable. That at some time, the proletariat, the working class, would recognize that they were being suppressed, and that they would then overthrow the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. He said that capitalism or America as a country would be a failed experiment, that we would eventually tear each other apart due to our desire or our greed to have more. So felt capitalism would eventually fall to class conflict and communism would be the result. We could talk a lot about the differences between socialism and communism, but essentially it is the idea that there would be a different distribution pattern of wealth and people would have more equal access. And we do have some aspects of socialism in our world. Public education, the entire society pays into public education. We all take from it. Some people don't need public education. They don't send their kids there or they don't have children. That's a socialist program. Communism is a little different. Communism is not utopian. It is the government has control and then gives to the people. As Americans, we often have a much harder time conceptualizing communism, and a lot of that comes from the Cold War, especially growing up during the Cold War, knowing that, we saw things like the USSR and communism being bad. And capitalism, to be fair, has worked rather well for our country. As we go through this, I would normally stop in class to show you guys videos. I'm going to link those videos in later in the folder on Blackboard for you, so you should have one for Marx and then again another one for Weber coming up. Marx said that for the conflict that he had predicted to occur, that first the people who were poor had to recognize that they were being unfairly treated. They had to develop what he called a class consciousness, this awareness, this understanding, this realization that they were somehow being treated unfairly. Once they were aware of that, they were going to have to then organize themselves, and eventually they would then revolt. And his entire theory was that since the bourgeoisie were so fixated on maintaining their power and their profits, that they would never be able to unify to fight against the proletariat. In the United States, we had an intervening factor with our government. Our government looked at labor unions and at first started to break unions, but later realized that in doing so, they were going to end up destroying our economy. And so they gave voice to our labor unions in the early 1900s, giving them some rights and giving workers some rights. Because of this, we start to have this emergence of a middle class. And being in the middle class usually means that you're not super wealthy, but you're not super poor. And we kind of maintain the balance because most people in the middle class are rather content. Marx said that people who did not understand that they were being disenfranchised, that things were unfair, were trapped in what he called false consciousness. He said that social problems would be blamed on the individual rather than the society, and that was how people could excuse or kind of escape feeling like they were somehow also part of that kind of poorly treated, disenfranchised group of people. So I ask you guys, how would Marx explain poverty? Marx would look at poverty as societal failures, failures of the government, failures of people coming together to help others. But in America, we often will talk about poverty as a failure of the individual to work hard enough. And that's where you can start to see this kind of false consciousness according to Marx. It's really, really important to understand, however, that Marx is a single perspective. This is one person looking at very specific facts and using them to construct an idea about how society operates. This is very political in nature and very economic in nature, and therefore it doesn't explain all of the different intricacies of a society. Therefore, we have to turn to two other researchers. We talk about Emile Durkheim, and we'll also talk about Max Weber. Durkheim is another person who now looks at society in a different way. He looks at this as a broad agreement among its members, a broad consensus. And he says that there are social facts, that in every society there are patterns that are rooted in the society, not just in the experience of the individuals. So this goes back to that discussion we had about suicide, that being socially isolated, those social factors had as much of an influence on whether or not someone would commit suicide as psychological ones. Social facts are these kind of rules that guide society that we have expectations to kind of follow. Society, according to Durkheim, was either held together by mechanical solidarity or organic solidarity. Pre-industrial societies, societies that had come before the Industrial Revolution, were united by what he called mechanical solidarity. That people had this need to work together, social bonds, moral sentiments that actually kind of fused them together so they worked like a well-oiled machine. Strong dependence on tradition, pressure to conform, pressure to kind of be like the same group. So if you share in the moral sentiments, all those things unite you, you look like you are maybe mass-produced people. When we look at post-industrial society, we're organic in our solidarity. And so the way that I kind of try to remember mechanical versus organic, you have a lot of different organs that work in the entire part of your body to make you function. You have your heart, your lungs, your liver, all of those different organs. They're distinct and unique in themselves. So in organic solidarity, the bonds are actually based off of our ability to specialize. So back in pre-industrial societies, if you needed to raise a barn, you would call over the school teacher and the farmer and the doctor. Everybody would be there for a barn raising because it would have been tradition. It would have been this belief that everyone needed to work together like a well-oiled machine. But today, we wouldn't call those people over to help us, build our deck, because we would say they lack specialization. We would maybe get an engineer, or we would get somebody who does lawn service, or somebody who actually specializes in those kind of small structures. He does say that this shift actually leads to a decline in the trust that we have between members in our society. If you've ever been to the doctor, which I think we all have, you know that you pick special doctors based on what you feel your ailment is. If you're just generally sick, you'll go to a general practitioner. But you might not go to your general practitioner if you feel like you hurt your knee. In that case, you may feel like you trust a orthopedic surgeon more. And so you'll go to somebody who specializes in maybe knees and not just illness, even though they are all doctors and they can diagnose. So when we look at this, we start to see this breakdown in specialization. Same thing in school, you're going to go to a very specific teacher for help with an assignment, even if they're not your content teacher, because you're going to believe that they're going to have greater knowledge. And that's just how it works in our society. We look at specialization and we build off of people's specializations. Durkheim does warn that with all of this comes what he calls anomie, that as a society continues to move forward, there may not be this universal clear consensus, and that we might start to lack what he called moral guidance. So anomie would be a condition where social or moral norms are confused, unclear, or just not present. There's lots of examples of that. When we talked about the emergence of the internet, was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Was it a tool? What were the rules to it? And you might see a lot of time when you get on to like YouTube or something, they talk about how when the internet was first kind of brought online in like the early 2000s, that there wasn't this need for all these like government regulations. But today, now it's the wild, wild west, and really anything can happen, and maybe it's time for regulations. Same thing when we talk about stuff like stem cell research or abortion rights. If these are conversations that come up at every election term, if these are things that people are constantly still debating, then there's a question about whether or not we have made a decision about whether this is good or bad, or maybe we're just unclear as a kind of total idea as to how, as a society, we feel about these things. When I say that, you guys probably have very good individual thoughts about how you feel about major topics, but you might not know how the rest of society truly feels. The third and final major theorist that we talk about is Max Weber, and he's German, so the W sounds like a V. He's the one that looks at our societies, and instead of looking at what we call a macro view, he looks at it as a micro view. So Durkheim and Marx both looked at society as these very large constructs, these very large ideas. Weber says that it's not in the kind of large scope, that you actually have to look at it in a micro focus. So, sociologists must discover personal meaning, values, beliefs, and attitudes that underlie human social behavior, the small little details that make us unique and connected to the people around us. He says basically, you can't understand a society unless you walk in their shoes. He said that the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism was rational, and it actually reflected a more rational society, doing things in a way that was the most effective and really the quickest way possible. Traditionally, if you wanted to make a shirt, if you were the only person sewing it, it would take you time. You would have to gather your materials. Maybe you were even, weaving your own cloth. But with a rational move towards industrialization, you could mass produce shirts. You could minimize the amount of output that people had to do. You could lower costs. All of these things become much more efficient. He considered industrial capitalism the most rational thing. However, he feared that the more rational a society becomes, the more likely it is that we alienate people or we dehumanize people. And he was really pessimistic about our society's ability to kind of remove themselves from this trend. I really want you guys to watch this video, so again, I will link it in. Those are the three major people that you guys need to know about. Sociology has become a science largely through the efforts of American sociologists. It is an American science. It does exist other places, but we were the ones to kind of first develop it here. And it first started in Chicago. I am going to ask you guys to work on the American contributors chart. This is a chart that covers people that we don't have time really to talk about, but were really instrumental in the development of sociology. Your textbook is a great place to go for this, but if you choose to do some of this in class, you may absolutely use things like Google search and Wikipedia, but just remember, you want to be looking at their contributions to sociology. So if you have access to your textbook might be your better resource.